Hey, true crime fanatics, this is Claire.
And I'm Andy.
You're tuned in to the Homicide Hobbies podcast, which is a podcast for people who love to hear about the horrendous crimes that people commit. Enjoy. What do you have for us today?
Today we'll be in a place with a long history of beer brewing. They have over 7,000 different beer brands and 1,300 breweries.
Minnesota.
Oh, and also I made this note. I'm pretty sure you said it in one of your cases, but did you know beer is actually considered its own food group?
In Germany.
1/3 of the land is forests, and gummy bears were invented here.
I have no idea.
You kind of said it.
Germany.
Today we'll be in Germany, more specific.
Well, she already done guessed it right.
Kinda, yeah. With the whole beer is its own
food group.
Yeah. I didn't know that there were 7,000 different beer brands.
I'm kind of not surprised because it's like everybody's got their own craft beer thing.
Yeah.
I almost feel like it's probably more now.
Probably. I also didn't know gummy bears were invented in Germany.
I did not either.
But today we're going to be more specifically in Dusseldorf. That'll be our final destination. In advance, I ain't German, so I apologize for any mispronunciation of names. I wrote them out phonetically, but...
Say it in German!
9. 10. I don't know me no German. Anyway, this case was suggested by one of my sons when he was 14. He's now 16. And I don't know how I feel about it, especially since he heard of this feller in a book at the school library. But the feller we'll be discussing is a convicted serial killer. Aside from murder, he also committed arson, attempted murder, and brutal sexual assaults way back in the day.
Why is that in the school library?
I don't know. He was an active murderer from 1913 to 1930. He was dubbed the king of sexual perverts and also the Dusseldorf monster. He's the first known sexually motivated serial killer.
What year?
1913.
Oh.
Yeah. So this crazy perverted murderer we'll be discussing is Peter Kurten. He was born into extreme poverty and constant abuse on May 26, 1883. Which, by the way, I told my son that I finished this case, and I told him this feller was born 100 years before me. And he goes, no, he wasn't. And I was like, yes, exactly 100 years and like 3 months and a day. And he was like, no. And then he was like, what year were you born? And I was like, you know what? I've had enough of you.
The 1900s.
Yeah. Oh, brat. But anyway, I'm not sure about any head injuries for Peter, but there was definitely extreme mental and emotional.
Well, I feel like if he was born into a house of abuse, you can say he got a lot of head injuries.
Well, I don't know about any that were skull crushing.
Well, it doesn't have to be skull crushing. Enough knocks to the head. Look at the football players. It's head trauma.
Well, his father and mother had 13 children, and they lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with all their kiddos.
There's the head crushing. They had to pack them in like sardines.
Peter was the oldest child. Both his mother and father were alcoholics, and when Peter's father was drunk, which was during his waking hours, he would beat the crap out of his wife in front of the children. After her beating was sufficient enough, he would order her to strip naked and rape her in front of the children.
Well, that happened to be because they're in a 1-bedroom apartment. Anything he did was in front of the children.
Well, he would gather the kids.
They're not far away. They're like living in a living room.
Right, but to say, hey, stop what you're doing, come watch, I think is a bit disgusting, and that's not how I would imagine quality family time should go.
Well, it's the early 1900s. What else were they doing?
Anyway, when Peter was 5, he was having a play date with another child when he decided to see what would happen if he drowned his friend. He was stopped, and as far as I'm aware, the friend was just traumatized but did survive. His father's fists often found their way to Peter when they weren't assaulting his mother, and Peter would refuse to leave school because the abuse was so bad at home. And eventually, surprise, surprise, his grades began to suffer because of the excessive violence. Peter would often run away from home and be missing for days to weeks, and he befriended other social outcasts and criminals, and while living on the street and being a young child, he would have to resort to petty crimes in order to survive. So he would steal his necessities, food, clothing, things like that. As if his father wasn't subjecting poor Peter to enough abuse, by age 8, Peter became friends with one of his neighbors who was a local dog catcher. This feller was also not a good guy. He would let Peter tag along to catch the stray dogs. But yeah, Peter's away from his father's abuse and not living on the streets. But Peter ended up learning he could blow off some of his pent-up anger because this feller was twisted.
Could start killing the stray dogs.
And they would abuse and torture the dogs that they would catch. And then the neighbor and Peter would begin killing those dogs. Peter, surrounded by abuse, was intrigued by the violence, and instead of being terrified, Peter started torturing and killing the dogs alone. He didn't need the neighbor anymore.
Well, he figured out how to catch them.
Yeah. This is at 8, by the way. Around 9, Peter took a break from assisting the local dog catcher one day, and he was spending the afternoon with 2 friends from school, and the boys were out on a log raft. Peter knew the one little boy couldn't swim, and that little feller was a bit nervous out on the water, so Peter decided to push the boy off the log and into the water. And then when the other boy jumped in to try to save their friend, Peter reached down and held the second boy's head underwater until both boys drowned, and the authorities ruled the boys' deaths as accidental, and Peter was never charged with their deaths.
Oh. He was 9?
Yeah. That's my son's age. That's 3rd grade. By age 13, Peter begins his transition into becoming a true sexual pervert.
Well, I feel like every tween boy is a pervert.
I feel like he takes it to the extreme here because he had a girlfriend who's also 13, which, by the way, my daughter's 13, so it's really hard not to think of my children in this case. But she would get naked and let Peter cop a feel all over her body.
Oh.
But she would refuse actual intercourse. She'd do everything but that. I did tell my daughter, I was like, don't get naked for boys. You're 13. And she was like, what is wrong with you?
It's a long list. You got time?
Well, then Peter, extremely horny 13-year-old boy, he needed to blow his load before he'd burst. So rather than grab the lube and go take care of things himself, he went down to the community stables and would rape the village barnyard animals.
Right. I guess that's a better avenue, I think.
A side note.
He's tenderizing the chickens from the inside out.
Well, I thought it was kind of cool that they had a town farm or like a village barnyard because, I don't know, I just thought it was kind of interesting. And then Dusseldorf currently still has communal gardens for its residents, which I thought was pretty neat. But back to Peter. He enjoyed having sex with the barnyard critters at first because he had quite the variety. Sheeps, goats, pigs. They were his go-to pincushions.
How old is he now?
13. But after a while, I don't know if the critters became more compliant or if it was like a hot dog down a hallway situation, but Peter could no longer reach the same level of orgasm. I guess he needed the goat to put on a teddy. I don't know. But sexually bored and frustrated and no other options, Peter moped on down to the neighborhood barn for his regular visit with the local sheep, when as he felt his climax dwindling, Peter began stabbing the sheep. While he was raping it, as he stabbed and slashed up the sheep, he reached his greatest level of elation as the blood sprayed out of the sheep. The sight of the blood and the sheep thrashing until it died, while Peter's pecker was inside the sheep, Peter spontaneously ejaculated.
I don't feel like it's spontaneous. That's what he was there for.
Yeah, but to have his orgasm dwindling and then the sight of the blood, he was done. Ugh. But
I feel like it was more like the sheep was just taking it and was used to the visits, and this time it started pushing back.
Yeah, well, he killed the sheep, and Peter began to learn that the more stabs he inflicted on the animals, the easier he achieved orgasms. However...
Well, at what point do people start wondering why all the barnyard animals are dying from stabbing and having jizz dripping out of them? At what point do they're like, somebody's got to take a watch on these? There's a real sick feller.
And that's exactly what happened. The locals started noticing the dead animals and began keeping a closer eye on their critters.
This isn't a wolf problem.
So Peter had to suddenly stop internally salting the village barnyard critters.
Ew.
Oh, sure. You said tenderizing them. That's way different. But after he was caught, covered in blood, with his pants around his ankles,
and feathers in his underwear,
while stabbing a knife and his penis into the neighbor's squealing pig.
Oh my god. He was caught stabbing and fucking the pig?
Yes.
I feel like that person is traumatized for life.
So Peter wasn't allowed down by the barn anymore.
Can you imagine hearing a pig screaming and you go in to
No.
see what all the squealing's about and seeing somebody fucking in and stabbing it and just being like, the fuck is...
No, I could not. No. There were reports that he started doing the stray dogs too, but I only found like one or two articles that claim that.
That's because one probably bit off a nipple.
Well, I don't feel like it's too far-fetched that somebody just kind of ran with it. He was into bestiality.
Yeah.
It is what it is. But
he liked his ladies with hooves.
Now that Peter couldn't have sex with his girlfriend or the barnyard critters, Peter did the only thing he could think of. He went home and tried to rape his sister, who was a year younger than Peter. Fortunately, she was able to fend him off. Around the same age, Peter's father told him he was done with the schooling since his father was going to prison. Oh yeah, 1897, Peter's father was going to prison for 18 months because he was caught raping his oldest daughter, who was just 13.
My God.
Peter was 14. That's the same sister that Peter went home and tried to rape.
All right.
That little girl had been repeatedly raped by her father. That's when Peter's mother worked up the courage and filed for a separation from her abusive husband. But now, Peter would be the man of the house at just 14 years old, and he'd have to go get a job. So Peter started working as an apprentice molder. I did Google it. It's just somebody that builds molds, pouring molten metals into molds, like mold castings.
Mm-hmm.
He worked that job for nearly 2 years while his dad was in prison for 18 to 24 months. But after about 2 years at that job, Peter stole all the money he could get his hands on from his household. And then he stole the money from his boss and ran off. And I kind of was curious how close that came with his father being released from prison. Like, did he steal everything and get the hell out because he didn't want to be subjected to his father again?
Hmm.
At this point, Peter's 16 years old. He starts living with a prostitute who's 18 years old. The prostitute was willing to submit to most of Peter's sexual perversions, except the stabbings.
Except for when he told her to whinny.
Well, she would let Peter strangle her during sex. After about a month of being on his own, Peter was arrested for breaking and entering and theft, and he was sentenced to 1 month in jail. After he was released, he went back to his petty crime lifestyle, and Peter would spend the rest of his teen years and pretty much his adult years in and out of prison for petty crimes, along with more serious charges. But I don't plan on addressing all of his crimes because from 1899 to 1930, he was in jail 17 times for 30 different crimes, none of which, by the way, were murder. There was just a bunch of petty shit.
Well, and also right smack dab in World War I.
The Great Depression, all the things, yeah. So Peter was 16. He picked up an 18-year-old girl, and the pair were out doing their thing, just kind of hanging out, when they began engaging in sexual activity. Peter, struggling to have normal vanilla sex, began strangling the 18-year-old girl. When her eyes were bulging and her horrified expression disappeared because her body went limp, Peter was finally able to reach an orgasm. At this point, Peter learned his body and realized he would not achieve an orgasm without inflicting fatal injuries on his partner. Peter dumped the girl's remains and took off. Little did Peter know, he didn't actually kill the girl. She did survive. However, in 1899, she would have been branded a whore because she willingly engaged in sex. It just got a bit on the violent side. So she stayed quiet about her assault. By 1900, Peter was living in or around the town of Dusseldorf. Peter was really struggling with life. He was, again, like I said, in and out of jail for petty crimes until he shot and nearly killed a girl. And he was arrested and sent to prison for attempted murder. 4 years later, into that attempted murder sentencing, Peter was released from prison when he was drafted into the Imperial German Army.
That's what I was gonna be curious at. How he was like the perfect drafting age for World War I.
Yep. And even though he was drafted, Peter would use it as an escape from prison, and as soon as he was able, Peter deserted the army. But Peter was a lurking pervert with sexual desires. Peter went back to murdering local farm animals while he raped them.
Well, I feel like World War I was a perfect guise to get away with some shit.
Well, he would then set the barns, because he's doing this with wherever he was stationed, the individual barns. He would go rape those animals, kill them, and then set the barns on fire. And we would watch at a distance while the local emergency service members would attempt to put out the fires. And Peter would achieve sexual gratification watching the animals burn alive. Peter would set 24 barns on fire before he was arrested for arson. He went to prison from 1905 to 1913 for arson, robbery, and desertion charges. While Peter was in prison, he claims he was abused by the prison guards. And that was when he began having more intense erotic fantasies about mass killings.
What year did he get drafted?
1904.
Huh. He got 1904?
Mm-hmm.
I thought he was born in 1883.
Yeah.
My dates might be wrong, but how did he get drafted several years before World War One?
So
Was that like a conditional, you can either do prison or join the military?
I know that World War I was July 28th, 1914 to November 11th, 1918, but Peter was drafted in 1904. Germany, during peacetime, men that were 20 years old would have to serve 2 to 3 years in active army, and then they could return to civilian life, but they were liable for recall up to age 45. But I found it interesting because in August of 1914, so after World War I had started, Germany did their draft, and they went from roughly 808,000 soldiers to 3.5 million soldiers in 12 days, which I thought was absolutely crazy.
I think it was an option of like almost like a work release.
Probably.
You join the military to get out of charges.
Maybe. Well, while he was incarcerated for desertion, Peter began having more intense erotic fantasies about mass killings, and thinking about a naked woman would not turn Peter on. But thinking about committing a mass killing, ooh-wee, did that get his loins a-burning.
Oink, oink.
Mm-hmm. Having those thoughts would cause Peter to spontaneously ejaculate in his cell.
Hands free.
It was. He would just, if he saw blood or thought of mass killings, he would just jizz wherever.
You know, I've heard that about people with like arson things.
Mm-hmm.
They just, the flames really do it for them.
Then when Peter, who's now 30, found himself a free man on May 25th, 1913, the day before his birthday, he decided to go break into a tavern near the prison that he'd been recently released from. The owners of the tavern lived upstairs, but at the time of Peter's breaking in, they were downstairs tending to their clientele. As Peter lurked in the shadows looking for anything of value, he was about to leave empty-handed because they didn't have crap when he spotted a young child asleep in her bed.
Thought you were going to say a young dog or...
No, we've escalated. She's 9 years old. Her name is Christine Klein. Her parents were, like I said, the tavern owners, and they were downstairs. Peter seized the opportunity and jumped on the sleeping child. He immediately began strangling the little girl. When she woke up and struggled for quite a bit before Peter tightened his grip, crushing down on her throat, and she passed out. Peter then inserted his fingers in the child's vagina. While Christine was unconscious, Peter pulled out a small pocket knife, and with his knife in one hand and Christine's forehead in the other, he tipped the little girl's head back and dug his knife across her throat. The first cut was shallow, and blood began dripping out of Christine's neck. Mesmerized by the blood, he pressed the knife against her neck again, this time using more pressure. Peter watched as Christine's blood spurted out and began dripping onto the small carpet next to her bed. Peter dragged his knife 2 more times across Christine's neck and watched as her blood would spurt out for about 3 minutes, and the sound of Christine's blood hitting the floor and spraying on his hands caused Peter to spontaneously ejaculate.
He sure is backed up.
The next day, Peter returned to the tavern to listen to the shock and horror of all the locals discussing Christine's murder.
I'm disturbed that this story was in a school.
Right. Well, to be fair, I did ask him what he knew, and he knew of the bestiality and him being... We haven't gotten to it yet, but he knew like how this guy got his name in the media, and that was about it. So it was like a PG-13 version of this feller. So suspicion fell onto Christine's uncle, her uncle Otto, for her murder, because the day prior he'd asked for a loan from his brother, Christine's father. He had told Otto no. Otto publicly threatened his brother, saying he would do something that he would remember all his life. And the next day is when Christine was found murdered.
That guy's got real bad luck.
He really does, because he was arrested and charged with Christine's murder. But the jury found, although partially convinced of his guilt, they didn't feel there was enough evidence.
There shouldn't be any evidence.
Because he publicly threatened him, that was their evidence. And then they did find a handkerchief that said PK on it, which is Peter's initials, Peter Kurten. And it's also Christine's father's name is Peter, but I left that out because it's too many Peters to try to clarify.
This store does have a whole lot of Peters.
Mm-hmm. But because they found that, they figured it was from Otto that he had dropped a handkerchief from his brother. But thankfully, he was acquitted. After Christine's funeral, Peter would go visit the little girl's grave, and he would bend down and pick up a handful of the dirt covering her gravesite, and he would spontaneously ejaculate in his pants while letting the dirt run through his fingertips.
Ooh.
This guy has some issues. 2 months later, while committing another burglary, he had found a skeleton key, and he was just breaking and entering wherever he could. Peter stumbled upon a 17-year-old girl named Gertrude Franken asleep in what should have been the safety of her own bed. Peter attacked the sleeping teen, and he began strangling Gertrude. Blood began spurting from Gertrude's mouth because she had bit the side of her tongue. Peter, once again, spontaneously ejaculated at the sight of Gertrude's blood. But him nutting in his drawers early made him sexually satisfied, so he left, and he left her alive.
Yeah. He needed a nap.
Well, a few days later, he was arrested again for committing a burglary and setting more stuff on fire. He was sentenced to 6 years to be served in a military prison. Peter ended up serving 8 years because he kept getting in trouble while he was in the prison. By spring of 1921, Peter's now 42 years old, and he moves in with one of his sisters. I hope it's not the one he tried to rape when they were children.
Ugh, yeah.
But whichever sister it was, she gives him a roof over his head, and they were living in Altenburg, Germany.
I would not be able to forgive my brother.
No.
And even if it was not me, I'd feel like, maybe go move in with one of your brothers.
Right? So Peter's sister not only let him live there, but she also introduced her 42-year-old brother to her good friend, Augusta Scharf. I personally don't think Augusta was a good friend because I can tell you if our brother was an animal rapist, arson, committing burglar.
That's essentially a homeless 40-year-old man.
I wouldn't try to hook him up with my bestie. Then again, I guess you're my bestie, so that would just be weird. And Jason would be my backup bestie, so that's even more weird. But anyway, Augusta was 45 years old, so she's 3 years older than Peter. And she's not an innocent lady herself. She has quite a history.
She was fucking horses.
She was a reformed prostitute turned into a candy shop owner, and Augusta was also a fellow convict. Not for prostitution, though. She'd been sent to prison for murdering her fiancé.
This is like soulmates.
Peter and Augusta, they fell in love and got married. Peter and Augusta consummated their marriage with non-violent sex, but Peter could only get it up if he fantasized about the women that he had violently assaulted. Surprisingly, for a man who seemed to have his world revolve around sex, he would never initiate sex with Augusta. But if she initiated, he would subject himself to vanilla sex for her. Eventually, Peter and Augusta moved roughly 6 hours from Altenburg back to Dusseldorf. Once the happy couple were settled in Dusseldorf, Peter was still not initiating sex with Augusta. He began having 2 separate affairs, one with a servant girl named Tiad and a housemaid named Mek. And when Peter would have sex with either of his now mistresses, both Tiad and Mek were subjected to partial strangulation during sex with Peter. Tiad did not appreciate being strangled, and Peter tried to tell her that's what love means.
What?
Yeah. So Augusta ends up finding out about Peter's affairs, and she was livid with Peter. Because, dude, you're not having sex with me, but you're having sex with 2 other women? What the heck? Tiad and Mek decided to save their own hides, and Tiad went to the police and said that Peter had threatened her and accused him of seduction, which apparently in Germany is a crime, and Mek claimed that Peter raped her. Unsure if Peter had raped the women or threatened either of them, those charges were dropped. However, police would arrest him for the seduction and threatening accusations. He would be found guilty and sentenced to 8 months for seduction.
No, right?
I know, it's weird. To which he would only serve 6 months before being released. In exchange for his early release, the authorities said he needed to get the hell out of Dusseldorf, to which Peter agreed to get out of prison, but then after being released, he filed an appeal and won. He was allowed to stay out of prison and stay in Dusseldorf. But Peter never changed his ways. He's now 46 years old, and he began stalking a middle-aged woman named Frau Kuhn. Finally, when he could no longer resist the urge, on February 3rd, 1929, Peter crouched down in some bushes and waited for Frau to walk by. Hidden out of view of witnesses, as soon as she was within reach, he leapt out of the bushes and grabbed Frau by the front of her coat, and he shouted in her face, I don't think this translates correctly, but he said, no row, no scream, as he dragged her into the bushes. Peter then stabbed Frau 24 times with a sharpened pair of scissors. Many of the stab wounds were so deep that the scissors hit her bones. And then Peter also stabbed her in the temple. Somehow, Frau survived her assault from Peter. Peter, now unleashing all his pent-up sexual urges, set a sight on his next victim just 5 days after his assault on Frau.
So he just left her laying there and somebody else found her and she lives?
Yeah. Peter's next brutal assault would be inflicted on Rosa Ollinger. She was just 9. Peter strangled Rosa unconscious. Then he began viciously mutilating the little girl. Peter stabbed Rosa in the stomach a few times before he stabbed her in the temple. And in true form, during his vile assault on little Rosa,
he jizzed his pants.
Peter spontaneously ejaculated. As if Peter could not get any more grotesque, he wiped his semen on his fingers, then inserted his semen-covered fingers in Rosa's vagina. Then he repeatedly stabbed the 9-year-old child in the vagina with a final stab wound to her heart. Exhausted, Peter hid Rosa's body under a hedge. The following day, he returned to Rosa's remains and set her on fire with kerosene. And at the sight of the flames, Peter would spontaneously ejaculate. The next day, Rosa's remains were found. So, just 5 days after Peter had murdered Rosa, or I guess technically 2 days after her body was found, he attacked a 45-year-old mechanic named Rudolf Scheer. Peter stabbed Rudolf 20 times, mainly in his head, back, and also gouged out Rudolf's eyes. And after police found Rudolf's remains, they interviewed those in the surrounding area, mainly onlookers, see if they saw anything suspicious. And when you know it, Peter returned to the scene of the crime. He told police that somebody had called him on the phone to tell him about the murder of the mechanic, and that's why he came on down there. Even though Frau was a middle-aged woman, Rosa was a 9-year-old girl, and Rudolf was a 45-year-old man, police believed the assaults were committed by the same person. The stab wounds seemed to be similar. All 3 victims received stabs to their temple, and none of the victims were robbed. But the problem was, there was no evidence of who the murderer could be. Oh, and whoever they were looking for had a literal thirst for blood. The survivor, Frau, she had made the claim that kind of sank up with their investigation, which was that her attacker suckled at her gaping wounds to drink the blood.
Ew.
So between March and July, Peter would attack 4 other women. They all survive, all made the same complaint that their attacker would spontaneously ejaculate while mutilating them. He would suck at their wounds.
Lick their wounds.
Yeah.
That's disgusting.
By August 8th, 1929, Peter would meet a young woman who was just looking for love. Keep in mind, he's still married to Augusta. They set up plans to go on a date, though, the following Sunday, which was August 11th, 1929. This young woman's name was Maria Hahn. So a few hours into their date, Peter lured Maria into going on a walk with him, and he ends up brutally raping her and strangling her. Maria pled with Peter to spare her life, and instead, he began viciously stabbing her. But he didn't stab her to death, and he didn't want to leave another victim alive, but having already ejaculated, his desire to mutilate and murder was no more. So Peter just sat in the field where he had lured her to. For over an hour, he waited for Maria to take her final breath. He didn't want to just leave her to be found. So Peter was covered in Maria's blood, though, and he needed to hide her body because this took forever for her to actually die. Because he didn't want his wifey to connect the freshly murdered woman and the blood on his clothes to Peter. So Peter dug a shallow grave to stash Maria's body. Peter had no intention of leaving Maria buried. A few weeks later, Peter returned to Maria's shallow grave and dug her up. Originally, Peter's plan was to unearth Maria's remains and nail her corpse to a tree. He wanted to do like a mock crucifixion to horrify the townspeople. But she's been decomposing for a couple weeks. And unfortunately, Maria's remains were a bit too heavy for Peter to manhandle the way he wanted. because it turns out he couldn't hold her up against the tree while doing the nailing. So in defeat, Peter returned Maria's decomposing remains to her gravesite. However, first, Peter crawled into the grave and pulled Maria's decomposing body on top of his. He caressed her naked, mutilated remains, and in his embrace, he then defiled her decomposing body. Peter would insert his fingers into her rotting vagina and spontaneously ejaculate. Peter would then return to Maria's gravesite many, many times and lay on top of the dirt, and he would get satisfaction from knowing she was beneath him, and, you guessed it, he would spontaneously ejaculate in his drawers.
What is his wife doing in all this?
We'll get to that.
Like, where are his bloody and dirty clothes and jizzed inside of pants going?
Well, I don't know what he's doing with his clothes, but we'll get to worse.
I feel like if Dave came home looking like he rolled around in dirt and jizz in his trousers and blood all over his clothes, I'd have some questions.
So I don't know if he's washing his clothes or if he's telling her he's slaughtering critters for meat or what.
But he's not bringing home any meat.
I don't know. So in an attempt to throw police off his trail, he decided to not stop attacking people, but to change up his murder weapon with a knife. 10 days after killing Maria, in the early morning hours on August 21st, 1929, Peter randomly stabbed an 18-year-old girl. Peter then attacked and stabbed a 30-year-old man. Because enough is never enough for Peter, he also stabbed a 37-year-old woman. It was a busy day for him. All separate attacks, victims all chosen at random, all on the same day, all severely injured, all survived, all said their attacker suckled their wounds. 3 short days later, Peter was at the local fairgrounds. At around 10:30 p.m., he spotted 2 young girls. Louise Linson, age 14, and Gertrude Hamaker, she was just 5. They were cutting through the fairgrounds to return to their foster home when Peter stopped 14-year-old Louise and offered to pay her money if she would scurry off and go buy him some cigarettes. When you know it, he was even so kind-hearted, he offered to look after 5-year-old Gertrude while Louise went to get his cigarettes.
Ugh.
And Louise was like, "Sure, sounds good." So she ran off with Peter's money to go buy cigarettes, and Peter snatched up little Gertrude and ran off. Peter lifted her little body off the ground by her throat and proceeded to strangle the little girl into unconsciousness. He then slid his knife across her tiny throat and then tossed her body to the side and waited for Louise to return. When Louise returned with Peter's cigarettes, Peter attacked her. He began strangling the 14-year-old before stabbing her in the stomach. Peter repeatedly stabbed Louise's torso, with one of the stabs piercing her aorta. Somehow during Peter's vicious attack, Louise managed to escape his grasp, and she managed to run from Peter, getting nearly 20 feet from him before she collapsed or he tackled her. Peter then bit through Louise's flesh on her neck, followed by making 2 large slices across her throat. He then crouched over her dying body and sucked the blood from her wounds.
He's a real sick feller.
Mm-hmm. The following day, a 27-year-old woman named Gertrude Schulte had the unfortunate experience of crossing paths with Peter. Peter outright asked Gertrude if she wanted to go fuck, and she looked disgusted at Peter for propositioning her in such a way. She was a housemaid, not a prostitute. She told him, "Absolutely not, leave me alone." And then she made the mistake of saying she'd rather die.
Ooh.
Peter was angry and shouted at Gertrude, "Well, die then," as he lunged at the young woman and stabbed her in the neck, the head, the shoulder, and the back, then lapped up her warm, oozing blood. Somehow Gertrude survived her assault, but she could only provide a vague description of her vile attacker. A 40-ish white man, and he was a fairly good-looking feller. To keep police on their toes, Peter decided once again to change up his murder weapon. On the evening of September 30th, 1929, a 31-year-old servant girl named Ida Reuter was waiting at the local train station when she met her handsome man. He was very friendly and charming, and he introduced himself as Peter. She agreed to go to the cafe with him, and the pair seemed to get along spectacularly. She wasn't ready for the afternoon to end, so she agreed to go for a walk with the kind man. As they strolled along close to the Rhine River, Peter walloped Ida in the back of the head with a hammer.
What kind of pants is he wearing that he can walk around with scissors, a hammer, a knife? You're just strolling along.
Right? Peter continued to strike Ida with the hammer. Ida fell to the ground, injured and confused. Peter began raping Ida while she was unconscious, and during her assault, she came to. She begged Peter to please spare her life. Peter didn't utter a single word. Instead, he just began striking her with the hammer while he violated her. And then when she was dead, he orgasmed. Not even 2 weeks later, on October 11th, Peter met a 22-year-old woman, Elizabeth Dorrier. He met her outside the local theater. Elizabeth was a servant girl enjoying some time off. Elizabeth fell for Peter's charms and agreed to go to a cafe with him for drinks. Afterwards, they took a train to go for a stroll along the Klein-Dussel River. And just like Ida, Elizabeth was suddenly struck in the back of the head with a hammer. Peter then raped Elizabeth and beat her all over the head. And I say all over because he wasn't very particular with which area. It was just her whole head ends up being smushed.
It's not like it's going to stay still, so as it gets smacked, it goes one direction, he smacks a different direction. It's just like...
Mm-hmm. And then he put extra effort into making sure he crushed both of her temples with the hammer. He left her on the side of the river for dead. She was found the next morning around 6:30 and rushed to the hospital, where she remained in a coma until the following day when she succumbed to her injuries and died. Around this time, police announced that they had arrested a man who claimed he was the murderer of all these attacks. Peter was pissed. So he wrote an anonymous letter to police on October 14th stating that he killed Maria Hahn and buried her at the edge of the woods. On October 25th, Peter was feeling ballsy when he went to attack 2 more women. Both survived their beatings from Peter.
Well, he's not going to let people steal his thunder.
And those 2 women survived. Most likely, not only did he jizz in his drawers, but his hammer broke while assaulting them. Could you imagine getting hit and you're bleeding because your skin's broken and then having your attacker lick your wounds?
No.
It's disgusting. On November 7th, Peter found another little girl named Gertrude Alberman, which there's so many Gertrudes. It must have been like the name Ashley
or Mary
nowadays, or you know what I mean? Like a very common name. But he found a little girl named Gertrude Alberman. Gertrude was, again, 5 years old. He turned on this nice guy charm for the little 5-year-old and convinced her to go with him. And as soon as he had her alone, he lifted her tiny body off the ground by her throat and strangled her unconscious. Peter then reverted back to his scissors and stabbed Gertrude once in her temple. Her tiny body collapsed silently to the ground, and Peter proceeded to stab her in the temple and chest 35 times. Once he was finished with her, he tossed her tiny body in the weeds near a factory wall. During all of these murders and assaults, the police had received 13,000 letters from the public, and with help from surrounding police departments, they pursued every single tip. More than 9,000 people were interviewed, 2,650 clues were pursued, and a list of 900,000 different names compiled of possible suspects. It was insane.
It's also disturbing.
Right? 2 days after Peter murdered Gertrude, he wrote a letter to the local communist paper, and Peter again anonymously confessed to murdering Maria Hahn, and he even included a map of where Maria's remains could be located. And on November 15th, 1929, police discovered Maria Hahn's shallow grave at the exact location the anonymous letter had described. An angry mob of townspeople were at the gravesite as police dug up her remains. Peter joined in with the angry townspeople. Graphologists examined the letters that were sent to the newspaper and the police department and determined they were written by the same murderous piece of garbage. Peter would go on and commit several non-fatal hammer attacks and attempted strangulations. All of these victims would survive and provide descriptions of their attacker. He maimed a total of 10 more people, and all of them would say that he would lick their bloody wounds. And it was kind of like every time he jizzed in his drawers, the desire to attack was no more.
It kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
He was taken after the barnyard animals.
Pretty much. On May 14th, 1930, 20-year-old Maria Budlick was at the Dusseldorf train station, and she met a man. They began chatting. She was new to the area in search of a job and a place to stay, and she wanted to know, could he recommend a local hostel she could stay at? And he was like, I know a place, and I'll escort you there myself. And she was super grateful to this stranger and began following behind.
Let me grab my hammer.
She began following behind this kind stranger. However, she stopped and became concerned when she noticed that this fellow was trying to lead her along an isolated path through an empty park. She was like, absolutely not. No way. I'm not going that way. I'm not stupid. And he was like, this is the way to get there. We have to go this way. And she's like, I'm not stupid. I'm not going in there. And as the pair were sitting there arguing, another man approached and asked Maria, "Are you okay? Or is this feller harassing you?" And she nodded, and the first feller was like, "Whatever, heck with you." He shrugged and walked away. Maria was extremely grateful to the man that came to her aid, and when you know it, he introduced himself as Peter.
It's Peter.
Yeah. Peter invited the now upset and overwhelmed young woman back to his apartment for food and drinks before she would go on her way. Once in this guy's apartment, she suspected that her hero was expecting sex. But she wasn't that kind of girl, and when she rejected his sexual advances, he calmly offered to escort her back to a hotel. Instead, he led her into the woods where he grabbed her by the throat, strangled her, and raped her.
Germany has a problem.
Like we didn't know that. I referenced the 40s.
Well, 30s, 40s, apparently.
The 20s.
Yeah. This isn't the best time period for Germany.
Sure isn't. When Maria began screaming, Peter hurried up and finished.
Oh, he's good at that.
He sure is. He released the grip on Maria's throat, and she tried to convince Peter to let her go. She's like, "I have no idea who you are. I'm going to forget what you look like. I don't remember where your apartment was."
And he really just jizzed on my knees, so we'll call it fair.
And she's like, "I don't even know the area. I wouldn't be able to make it back to your apartment, even if I wanted to." And surprisingly, because he just jizzed out, he was like, "All right, you can go.
Lock the door on your way out."
Well, they were in the woods, but Maria was distressed, but she did not go to police. Instead, through her tears, she wrote a letter to her best friend describing what happened to her. However, Maria did not address the letter correctly when she dropped it in the mail. 5 days after Maria's rape, her letter was opened by a post office clerk.
Uh-oh.
After invading her privacy and reading the details of her assault, the post office clerk forwarded the letter to the Dusseldorf police. The chief inspector went and talked to Maria about what had happened to her, and she agreed to lead the police to the man's home. The landlady opened the door to Peter's apartment, and Maria confirmed for the police that this was the location of where she had been with this feller that had ended up raping her and assaulting her. The landlady informed the police that the tenant's name was Peter Kurten. But while Maria, the chief inspector, and the landlady were inside Peter's apartment, Peter was headed down the hallway. He spotted the trio in his doorway. He did an about-face and hightailed it out of there. Peter's next decisions I did find a bit shocking because he then ran home to his wife. So I guess he kept an apartment separate, but he ran home to his wife and confessed that he had raped Maria Budlick and that the police were going to be looking for him. And he also explained to his wife that with his previous criminal history, he'd probably get about 15 years in prison. Peter and his wife agreed that Peter should go to a neighboring district to hide from the police.
What?
Yeah. I can tell you if Jason came home and told me he raped and tried to strangle some girl, I wouldn't be like, "Let me help hide you."
I'd ask him for his hammer.
Be like, "Sure, go hide over there." Doop, doop, doop. 911. Peter stayed away for a few days until May 23rd. He came home and visited his wife, and he was like, "I gotta tell you something." And she's like, "What?" He said he was the perpetrator the police and media were now calling the Vampire of Dusseldorf, which that's the name that my son knew him as, and that he was going around licking people's wounds. Augusta was livid with Peter. She told him that he should just go kill himself, and she might as well kill herself too, because he's messed up her life so bad.
The shame.
Yeah. Peter was like, "No, I love you, Augusta." And he concocted a plan to try to comfort his wife. He told her he wanted her to be taken care of when he goes to prison. He told his wife to tell the police that he was the Vampire Dusseldorf
to get the reward.
Yeah, and that she would help them capture Peter so that she could collect the reward money. The following day, Augusta did just that. She didn't take much convincing. And she contacted the police and told them exactly what Peter had told her. He was the Vampire Dusseldorf. She also told the officers she was supposed to go meet Peter outside their church later that day. That very afternoon, Peter was arrested at gunpoint. Peter admitted to his guilt. He confessed to being the Vampire Dusseldorf. He even confessed to the 27-year-old unsolved murder of 9-year-old Christine Klein, the unsolved attempted murder of 17-year-old Gertrude Franken. In total, Peter was connected to 79 crimes of violence, 9 murders and 31 attempted murders he would be charged for. Peter justified his heinous acts by blaming what he witnessed thanks to his alcoholic, abusive father.
Okay, well, he has 12 other siblings. How many of them grew up to be assholes?
It's funny because I saw a lot of comments on articles that people said the same thing. What happened to his siblings? I'm assuming they had some semi-normal lives, or maybe they died when they were drafted, the brothers. But they didn't go on to
be vampires.
Yeah. Oh, Peter also insisted he didn't do the children wrong because he didn't torture any of them. He just killed them, then played with their bodies after they were dead, which I found vile.
Yeah.
Peter shocked the detectives and psychologists when he admitted that the sight of the victim's blood would cause him to spontaneously ejaculate. And he further explained that he was going to kill the women, but once he ejaculated, if he hadn't finished murdering them, he would just simply stop the assault, apologize to the women, and tell them that's just what love is. And then Peter confessed that the rapes he committed while simply strangling victims, when he would ejaculate quickly, that was the reason those women survived. And then Peter also explained why some of the victims received more stab wounds than others, but there was a simple explanation for that. Peter would resort to stabbing because when strangulation didn't get the desired orgasm, he would resort to the stabbing, and then he would just repeatedly stab like he did with the critters until he reached orgasm. So some required more stabs than others in order for Peter to climax. He further explained his bloodlust to the stunned officers, and he said he drank the blood from the sliced throats of his victims, and that one of the victims, he sucked the blood and crushed the temple of another, and he was licking those wounds and licking the victim's hands. And in the Maria Hahn murder, he drank so much of her blood from her neck wound that he ended up vomiting blood.
Yeah.
He also admitted to his necrophilic embrace with Maria's remains after he attempted to crucify her to a tree. Peter also admitted to having decapitated a swan in the spring of 1930 in order to be able to drink the blood from the animal's neck. He ejaculated during that process.
I wonder how many times he spontaneously ejaculated while telling the stories.
I have no idea. He also told the officers he attacked nearly all his victims while his wife was at work and only changed up his scissors for a knife and then a hammer and back to scissors to try to fool the detectives into believing.
And I feel like all of it was his wife's stuff because it doesn't sound like he did much in the way of work. So it's like it was probably her hammer, it was probably her scissors, and she's probably doing where the hell is my shit?
Yeah. Well, he said he'd swapped up all of his murder weapons to try to fool detectives into believing there was more than one murderer on the loose. Peter tried to claim he attacked people to fight back against an oppressive society.
What?
And not for sexual gratification.
What?
Yeah. I was like, liar, liar, jizzed pants on fire. He sexually assaulted all his female victims. Whether he penetrated them with his pepe or his filthy fingers, he was sticking things in women while strangling and stabbing or bludgeoning them in order to ejaculate. If that's not sexually motivated, I don't know what is. A quick fun fact for you. Peter Kurten, while giving interviews in 1930 to 1931, he was the first psychological studies done of a sexual motivated serial killer. I think he's the first. I tried really hard. I was going to do a German accent, but it was awful, so I'm not going to try. And during one of his interviews, Peter said, "There must be a higher being who gave in the first place the first vital spark to life. That higher being would also deem my actions good since I revenged injustice.
What?
The punishments I have suffered have destroyed all of my feelings as a human being. That's why I have no pity for my victims. It was all the same to me whether they were women or girls or children or men. I had to kill. I did not kill either people I hated or people I loved. I killed whoever crossed my path at the moment my urge for murder took hold of me." I was like, what? He thinks that God would be proud of him? What?
Andrew, he's licking people's wounds.
That's true.
How much logic do you want to apply to things that come out of his mouth?
On April 13th, 1931, Peter's trial began. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense attorney described Peter as being the king of sexual delinquents because he unites nearly all perversions in one person.
And that's not a badge of honor.
No, it's definitely not. Peter was kept in a large shoulder-height iron cage, heavily guarded. only partially out of fear of him escaping, but mostly to help keep the angry relatives of his victims from attacking. I say they should have unleashed the family on him, or the families.
Mm-hmm.
But he was kept safe. Unfortunately for Peter, he was found to be sane, gross and depraved, but sane nonetheless. He was tried for 9 of the murders and only 7 attempted murders. And after several days into Peter's trial, he decided to change his plea to guilty. He also spoke to the court, saying, "I have no remorse. As to whether recollection of my deeds makes me feel ashamed, I will tell you that thinking back to all the details is not unpleasant at all. I rather enjoy it." When asked why he confessed, he said, "Why don't you understand that I'm fond of my wife, and that I'm still fond of her? I have done many wrongs. I have been unfaithful over and over again. My wife has never done any wrong. Even when she heard of my many prison sentences that I have served, she said, 'I won't let you down, otherwise you'll be lost altogether.' I wanted to fix for my wife a carefree old age." Peter's trial lasted 10 days, and after 2 hours of deliberation on April 22nd, 1931, the jury found Peter guilty on all charges and sentenced him to death by beheading. Peter, instead of filing an appeal, wrote a letter asking to be pardoned of the death penalty, and on July 1st, his pardon was denied. He was served his last meal that evening. He ordered him Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of wine, and some fried taters.
I'm surprised he didn't ask for him to be mashed with his hammer.
I'm surprised he didn't want like a rare steak.
It's already too cooked for him.
Right? He even had seconds. He also was allowed to write a letter to his wife apologizing for all the things he put her through, and he wrote letters apologizing to the relatives of some of his victims. The following day, on July 2nd, 1931, Peter was escorted to the guillotine to be beheaded. His final words came in the form of a question as his head was placed on the guillotine. Well, on the block. He asked, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." I was like, this guy is disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
After his execution, his head was cut in half, his brain was removed, and the head was mummified. They studied his brain in an attempt to explain his personality and his behaviors, but they found no abnormalities. And a fun fact, Peter's retired prostitute turned candy shop owner, Augusta, her maiden last name, that Scharf, it's spelled Scharf. In English, it means sharp, which I thought was kind of funny because he stabbed with the Sharpies. Another fun fact, at the end of World War II, Peter's head was brought to the United States and is currently on display in Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin.
Ew.
But that is Peter Kurten and the sick son of a bitch that he is. And I don't know how I feel about my son bringing me that case 2 years ago.
I don't feel like I know how I feel about it being in a school.
No.
Even if they left out spontaneous ejaculation, I feel like, do they really need to be learning about bestiality? That's what we're focusing on?
Dude, when he was telling me that the guy was into bestiality and he was known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf and that he spontaneously would ejaculate at the sight of blood, I was like, what are you reading at school? And then he like snort laughed.
I feel like they should have grown up like we did and be exposed adults. So like, wait, there are people who fuck animals, not in middle and elementary school knowing what bestiality is.
Right. I was horrified, but yeah. Thankfully, it didn't stick in his brain because when I told him the other day that I had finished this case, he's like, "I didn't tell you that case." And then I had to refresh his memory with slight details, the PG.
Why?
The PG version.
You gotta let him bury that deep.
And he's like, "Oh, yeah." As soon as I said the Vampire of Dusseldorf, he's like, "Oh, I remember that guy." And he's like, "Didn't he do stuff to animals?" And I was like, "Yep, that's the feller." And then he snort laughed and he's like, "I forgot about that." So glad I could remind him. But anyway.
That was pretty disgusting.
Dude, that's why when I was telling you the other day on the phone, the case I had coming for you, the feller would spontaneously ejaculate through the whole case. And the number of times I wrote spontaneously ejaculates, it was so frequent that now, because some of it I typed on my phone, every time I hit an S, the word spontaneous pops up.
Oh.
But that's all I got.
Well, thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to Homicide Hobbies. I'm Claire.
I'm Andy.
Follow us each week to get your fix of the atrocities that occur in true crime. And don't forget to tell people about us and rate us if you like us. But don't rate us if you didn't. Just change the channel.